Hi, welcome to this edition of the FDTD Satellite Applications webinar. The title for this webinar, an operational review of the May 1st, 2023 localized blowing dust event across South Central Illinois. This is presented by both James Otten in the Lincoln Forecast Office and Marshall Fowler from St. Louis, Missouri. Next slide, please. This is part of a series of webinars. The link is there in the blue box. I'm Scott Lindstrom, and Dan Bykos at CIRA is my co-coordinator, and we're always looking for speakers. So if you want to speak or you want to volunteer someone else to speak, let us know. We can create imagery. It's a great way to talk to your peer forecasters about something you've observed while forecasting. Next slide, please. This should be about 20 minutes. Send any questions you have to go to chat, or you can ask during Q&A during the follow-up. We'll be done by the bottom of the hour. Don't press hold. Mute when you're not speaking. Take it away, Marshall. Take it away, James.
All right, thank you. Without further introduction, so this ended up being a bit of a surprise to both of our WFOs, and ended up being probably one of the most significant events in terms of at least loss of life as well as injuries so far this year, and I guess probably even for last year. So this event has been certainly worth taking a closer look at, and the applications of the dust RGB from GHOST 16, which certainly helped us in the process. So we ended up with, so this occurred on May 1st, earlier this year. We had two narrow plumes of blowing dust that occurred across South Central Illinois, and they resulted in very localized but near zero visibilities. And that included across the I-55, which runs basically between St. Louis and Springfield. And that is where we had the most significant impacts. And that included multiple vehicle accidents as well as pileups, more specifically along the Sangamon and Montgomery County lines. And we ended up having 7 fatalities and 37 injuries reported to us from the Illinois State Police. So a pretty significant event. You can see this picture on the left, kind of the aftermath where a lot of the vehicles ended up catching fire. And it really looks like a pretty apocalyptic scene in the wake of the blowing dust. So to do kind of analysis of the blowing dust here, we really kind of have to take a couple of steps back. And that includes looking at just what our land cover is out in South Central Illinois. Unsurprising, it's actually a lot of cultivated crops, but this ends up kind of translating to a lot of just open fields, a lot of open spaces. There are some groves of trees in different places, but pretty open space of farm fields. And during the late spring, and including in early May, as we've already seen in this case, many of the spring and summer crops are being planted, and that requires tilling in most of these farm fields. So normally that's not an issue, but through the beginning of May, we had D0, so just abnormally dry conditions, expanded and introduced across a large corridor, extending all the way from West Central through East Central Illinois. And these conditions can be attributed to an abnormally dry April that we had leading up to this time period. And to further illustrate that, which shown here on the left is our accumulated precipitation from April 1st through May 1st, and that is the percent of normal. So a lot of this area, a pretty broad area of anywhere from 50% of normal and perhaps even approaching 25% of normal through that about 1 month period. And so this dryness occurred after near average precipitation in March. This is the This time series on the bottom is showing the accumulated precipitation versus normal for Springfield, which is just north of our area of interest. And you can see there were a couple of more significant precip events in March. But once we got to April, there were a few events, but we really fell behind the curve in terms of normal rainfall through the month of April. And this is also important because climatologically, as we get into May, this is when we're getting into the wettest times of the year. So the dry April contributed to soil moisture decreasing down to the 5th and even down to even the 5th and 20th percentiles by the beginning of May. Shown on the left is the 0 to 2 meter soil moisture percentiles from this NOAA sport. You can see across this area that these kind of redder, darker shades are the lower percentiles. So some of those areas all the way down to the 5th percentile, the red shading. And although these are not extremely dry, at least over a large portion of this area, they were dry enough to allow, when they were tilled, the dry soils to be exposed. Normally that would be kind of buried beneath, and some of these soils were also finer and very vulnerable to be getting carried by gusty winds. So synoptically, the weather pattern across the region, your eyes already go to it. It's a pretty anomalous, deep upper level cyclone across the Great Lakes. And this cyclone established deep cyclonic northwesterly flow across the Midwest and including through Illinois. Although we had cyclonic flow, the center of the cyclone was well off to our northwest, and any sort of kind of smaller waves moving through that flow, as well as the deeper moisture, or at least more appreciable moisture, was also off to the northwest. So there were not really any good sources of lift or any sort of nearby convection or even precipitation to that area. At the surface, we also had northwesterly broadly cyclonic flow, and that was enhanced by a fairly tight surface pressure gradient. And aside from a weak surface pressure trough here highlighted on the MSLP field from the WPC's analysis, extending from about central Illinois or central Indiana through central Illinois, there were really no notable surface features. No cold front, no convective outflow boundary. The features that we're usually thinking of when we think of blowing dust events. So here is kind of comparison of two different soundings from Lincoln, Illinois. The 12Z sounding shown here in yellow with the 0Z in cyan. And these soundings between these two different time periods sampled a deepening boundary layer all the way up to 725 hectopascals, along with significant drying through that layer just through significant mixing. And as the boundary layer deepened, we ended up tapping into some stronger flow aloft, about 30 to 40 knots, and that could be transferred then down to the surface. Also noteworthy is that our precipitable water actually decreased to 9.1 millimeters or 0.36 inches by 0Z on 0Z 2nd of May, which is actually below the 10th percentile of climatology for the Lincoln Rayab. This is also further supplementing the new CAPS derived soundings. This is a GIF basically showing some of the soundings running from north to south. But what's shown here is that during these are valid at 1930Z, so we're looking at mid-afternoon, is that there was a local maximum of low lapse rates. So, and those were super adiabatic, especially just above the surface across south central Illinois. And this local maximum suggests that boundary layer mixing was probably most pronounced where we saw these plumes of blowing dust, basically in that little corridor there between Springfield and St. Louis. And so with that deep mixing and tight surface pressure gradient, we saw sustained winds of 15 to 30 knots and occasional gusts of 30 to over 40 knots at times from around 14 to 23 Z on May 1st. And this included a peak wind gust of 47 miles per hour measured at Springfield, Illinois, which is shown here on the map. And the time series of the sustained wind gusts and peak wind is shown below that. That occurred around 21 Z. But then we'll look here. There was also Taylorsville, which is a little bit to the southeast, also indicating occasionally strong gusts of 30 to 40 knots. Although these were pretty representative of the wind gusts, we had no ASOSs or AWOSs that were properly positioned to actually capture the diminished visibilities from the blowing dust. So with that, I will pass it on to James.
Okay, thank you, Marshall. Yeah, so the we started looking, I would say the first thing that clued us into something that was going on in that area, and we weren't exactly sure where it was, but we were getting some pictures from Twitter showing a lot of dust being blown across Interstate 55 somewhere south of Springfield. Weren't quite sure where it was. We conferred with St. Louis office as well, with Marshall. They were seeing the same thing, and we started looking at the RGB data, the dust RGB data, to see if we could pick up on maybe pinpointing where it was. Part of our discussion was, is it an RCWA? Is it their CWA? What do we issue for this? And as you saw in the loop, and hopefully we get the loop going again, you can see that the pink area that shows up on the satellite, the dust RGB, you can see, don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can kind of see right in here, south of Springfield, southwest of Taylorville, right there where the Sangamon and Montgomery County border is, you start picking up some pink areas, which is an indication that there's some dust being blown across the interstate in that area. We also began to pick it up in other areas, which became a concern, but we weren't getting any other reports of blowing dust or anything like that from anybody except in this area, which was right there at the interstate. Next slide. One of the things afterwards, you're able to see the plumes of blowing dust were most apparent, obviously on the dust RGB, but you could also see it on the ash, which is the bottom left, right in here, and you can see it on the SO2 RGB as well, which is the bottom right one here. One thing evident, it was that it was not visible on the actual visible satellite imagery when we were looking at that. So we tried to correlate or collaborate exactly what was going on with other tools, other parameters, and we weren't able to see that except on these three that you see here. So with the blowing dust unexpected, we were not really expecting this to happen, so we really weren't watching the dust RGB. We knew there was tilling going on because this is major time when they were planning. We knew it was going to be some blowing dust. We had this listed, I believe, in a couple of our products in the morning, but to this severity, we were not expecting. Well, we were not expecting that. But we began to monitor the RGB when we picked up on. Here's one of the first Twitter pictures that I remember seeing on this particular day, that there was some blowing dust between DeVernon and Farmersville. I-55 lanes, both northbound and southbound, were closed. And so we were unsure if there was anything else going on until we got another tweet or a couple tweets from IDOT and Illinois State Police indicating that there had been an accident. I do remember, not sure exactly what St. Louis, how they progressed in their discussions at the office, but we did coordinate with each other on what we're going to do. But I do remember discussing with people in the office, hey, we need to upgrade our HWO, put out an SPS, try to enhance this a little bit more so people get the word. But that was before we realized how bad everything had happened. So like I said, we we reacted to the Twitter pictures that we're seeing, the RGB that we were analyzing, and we did issue a blowing dust warning, which was not necessarily through GFE, but we were able to issue that at least for a few counties, because it did look like from the RGB that it was extending further into Christian and Shelby County here to the southeast. And then St. Louis also was issuing and putting out social media posts to try to enhance that, to get the word out with what was going on and what we were seeing. Next slide. So after we got everything out, it was great, and we started to find out what happened. But the next day, on the 2nd of May, we began to get a similar, something similar occurring in the very same location. So the conditions were pretty close to the same. The winds were pretty high. Visibility started to drop off in the same area. So in that Sangamon County, Montgomery County connection right there where I-55 is. And we got notification from IDOT through Twitter that they shut down I-55 again in the same area, northbound and southbound, just to make sure that there wasn't any additional accidents from the more blowing dust that was going on out there. I suspect that they were out there cleaning up, and they began to see what was occurring, and they preemptively went ahead and closed things down so as to avoid any further accidents and probably injuries to them, as well as they're trying to work to clean up the interstate and the median and stuff like that. So unfortunately for us, the RGB, the dust RGB on that particular day was of no use. This is just a static image, but it would have been in this area here where my cursor is. There's a lot of pink in the area, but we weren't getting anything in the loop that really indicated that there was some sort of plume in that same location. So you can go back one more. We did issue, or there we go. So on that particular day, since they'd already shut things down, we went ahead and issued the dust storm warnings, the polygon type dust storm warnings for the same area, or generally same area. And I know St. Louis did the same thing. We collaborated on that as well, since it was in both of our CWAs. Okay, next slide. And as you can see on the RGB, that there was not useful at all in determining where it was located at and kind of helping us out, or how extensive it was. And next slide. So several factors contributed to the first one on May 1st, with the localized blowing dust across south central Illinois. There was the freshly tilled dry soils, very fine in the farm fields. After the abnormally dry April, we had the stronger northwest winds, 15 to 30, with some gusts 30 to over 40 knots, due to the tight surface pressure gradient in the boundary layer that was deeply mixed. And as you could see in the other products we were using, you could see the super adiabatic lapse rates, which really kind of enhanced that winds and brought more down from higher up. The blowing dust was definitely detectable on the dust RGB and some of the other GOES 16 RGB products. To help us with that, as we verified what we were seeing on Twitter and from the public, IDOT, and Illinois State Police. So that helped us verify what was going on, collaborating with looking at the satellite as well. Very helpful locating and characterizing the blowing dust, how far extensive it was, and it helped us with both St. Louis and us. It helped us with our messaging and the products that we were putting out. Unfortunately, on the 2nd of May, even though we were getting similar reports, fortunately no accidents, but similar reports as far as strong winds and blowing dust, the RGB was not helpful at all. Maybe because it was less severe, not really sure, but it did help. But the reports we used were helpful in getting us to put more warnings out again to alert the public and other entities of what was going on in that area. And I think that's it. So are there any, Marshall, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay.
Well, thanks. That was great. So Montgomery County is St. Louis and Sangamon County is Lincoln. Is that okay?
That's correct.
I had a question about the winds on the second when you couldn't see anything. Were they similar? Were the wind speeds similar on the second compared to the first?
I was thinking that there were a little bit less. I don't think we were getting over the 40 knots that we had the day before,
Okay.
if I remember correctly. Does that sound right, Marshall?
Yeah, I do remember them. They were still pretty strong, but I remember them being around five knots or so weaker.
Okay. And we do have a question from Brian Curran, who I believe is in Midland, Texas. Is the dust RGB? I don't know if the answer. I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know if you will, but is the dust RGB tuned to sandy soils? Because of course, in central Illinois, you don't have a lot of sandy soil. It's more kind of a loamy, clayey loess. So I'm just kind of wondering, maybe that's a question for anybody, but what kind of soil type do you need for a really good signal in the dust RGB? I don't know the answer. I guess that's just something to ponder. Do you expect to see do you expect to see a good signal? Brian, do you know the answer? I mean, that's a good question.
That is a good question. I don't know the answer, but I will say there are areas of central Illinois where we do have sandy soils. Closer to the Illinois River, south of Peoria, it's a little bit more sandy in that area. And then also toward the Wabash River, there's some sandiness over there as well, but not where this occurred. This is not sandy soil there. So that's a good question though.
Yeah. And there's a comment from Kevin Fuel from Sport. The dust RGB has channels that are sensitive to desert dust because of the quartz type of particle versus the dirt dust type of particle. So you might not actually expect to see this with freshly plowed dirt. So that's interesting thing to consider. I was struck by how small how geographically constricted the signal was and how it seemed to be just a very unlucky place for this plume to form because it blew over an interstate versus if it had formed 5 miles to the east, this kind of catastrophe would not have happened. And Kevin has another comment. It might be something other than quartz, but what the particle is made up of makes a difference. Maybe I should unmute Kevin. He has a lot of comments. The West Texas area has a similar agricultural dust events, and the dust RGB also has a weak signal there. So I guess we need to, maybe the dust RGB isn't the greatest name for this RGB, but it's a nice short one because that was blowing dust and you could see it.
I'm sorry. When I looked at the RGB on the first, there were other spots where I thought it might be occurring, and there was blowing dust elsewhere, but not. As you mentioned, maybe it was because this was just an unlucky place where it was really bad. Maybe the field was really close to the interstate. I don't know, but there was blowing dust elsewhere, but it didn't have this kind of an effect. But 55 is a heavily traveled interstate, especially when you start getting into the afternoons. It's very busy.
Yeah.
So
this was a very hard forecast event or event to keep on top of because of its small scale, I think. And you don't know who's plowing when. Don't have that kind of database in AWIPS. Which farmers are plowing today?
Yeah, that's been the struggle on kind of we've been reviewing this event and kind of thinking like, well, where do we go from here? And that's one of our main questions, but are we going to be able to get that answered? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have much?
I'm sorry. I was just going to say we were messaging blowing dust, so
Yeah.
I mean it's, you know.
Do you have a lot of interaction with the agricultural community on that kind of thing, like when plowing starts, or is that just something that's more? I mean, I guess I'll just end the question there. Do you have do you have any kind of interactions with the agricultural community on when farm work is occurring?
No, but that's perhaps something motivated by this event, of course, to perhaps, you know, find kind of reach out to some of our partners or establish new partner connections on, and basically, you know, even just like recognizing patterns and combining that with when fields maybe being plowed in certain areas may help us with, like, you know, just messaging even just the possibility of blowing dust. But yeah, that's probably something that's going to be motivated after this event.
Yeah, because I mean, we have a family farm up in Farmer City, and I have no idea when the plowing is happening there. So,
I'll say that's kind of what I expected Marshall to say, since their office is in a metro area. We drive around the fields every day on the way to work, on the way home. Even though we may not be talking to the farmers, we do know what's going on locally, because we're around it. There's farm fields even around our office. So our previous MIC was from Farmersville, Ernie Goach, and so he always let us know what was going on toward that area. We used to have an ASA whose husband is a farmer here locally. We were aware of what was going on, or we normally are during the spring months. We know what the farmers are going through, whether it's, oh, we can't get in the fields because it's too muddy in the fall to harvest, can't get out into the fields in the spring because it's too wet to plant, various things like that. It's not warm enough because it's still too cold, the ground's still too cold. We're kind of attuned to what's going on out there, and like I said, we kind of knew there was blowing dust. We knew that it had been dry. We knew that they've been plowing and getting in the fields, and a lot of the dust was blowing around. So, like I said, though we don't talk to them, we kind of know what's going on with what's going out there with the farmers and what they're dealing with.
right. One more comment from Kevin at Sport, Kevin Fuel. NASA Sport Land Information System that was shown was for the entire column of 0 to 2 meters, so that's what you showed. But a more shallow layer could be examined for pre-dust event awareness. So they looked at Sport, they looked at this for this event, and the shallow layers had a notable low percentile for soil moisture for the area of incident. So maybe that's a product that would be useful to see, not the 0 to 2 meters, but something like, I don't know, 0 to 2 centimeters or something at the very, very top layers. That might be something useful that, I know, Kevin, you could reach out to the Sue at Lincoln to coordinate that if that's something that can be provided. Okay, 0 to 10 centimeters, 0 to 40 centimeters. Well, I see it's at the bottom of the hour. If there aren't any further questions, I don't think I've seen any more come in through the chat. I haven't seen anyone raise their hand, have I? Let me look. I don't see any hands raised. So I'm going to thank James and Marshall for this talk. I found it very interesting. I guess I was asking a lot of questions. And that's all for now. Have a great day.